Late November 1945, California prisoner of war camp. The infirmary. Keiko Tanaka knelt beside the narrow bed and held the hand of a girl who had stopped breathing. The hand was already cooling. That terrible transition from body temperature to room temperature, from person to thing. Hana's face looked younger in death than it had in life. 17 years old. The fever that had burned through her for 3 days was finally gone. But so was everything else. Around Keiko, women wept. Some knelt like her. Others stood with hands pressed to mouths. All of them Japanese. All of them prisoners. All of them mourning one of their own in a land that had taught them to expect no mercy. Tomoko Nakamura emerged from the small room where the doctors had worked. At 52, she was the oldest among them. A former army nurse. A woman who had seen death before. Her face was carved from stone. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the weight of certainty. She stopped breathing. They could not find a pulse. She is gone. The words moved through the room like ripples in still water. She is gone. She is gone. Women who had survived war and defeat in the Pacific crossing now broke under this smaller loss, this preventable death. This young girl who had cried while eating her first full meal in months. This gentle soul who had never hurt anyone. Keiko closed her eyes. Tears ran down her face unchecked. She had thought she understood loss, had thought the war had taught her all there was to know about grief. But this felt different, personal, immediate. Hana had been more than a fellow prisoner. She had been a friend, a reminder that innocence could still exist even after everything they had seen. The other women pressed close, creating a circle of mourning, speaking in whispered Japanese, offering prayers, saying goodbye. The Americans had given them this at least. The dignity of farewell, the chance to be with their dead. Then footsteps, quick, urgent, moving against the current of grief. Wait, everyone wait, do not move her. An American voice, accented English cutting through the Japanese prayers. Keiko turned to see a man pushing through the grieving women. Not roughly, but with clear purpose, with the kind of focus that had no time for social niceties. Dr. Benjamin Hayes, 43 years old, gray at his temples, the camp physician. He carried a medical bag and his face showed something Keiko had not seen before. Not the professional calm he usually wore, but intensity, almost desperation. He shouldered past them, bent over Hannah's body, pulled back the white sheet that someone had drawn up to her chin, placed 2 fingers against her throat, pressed harder than seemed necessary, harder than seemed kind. What is he doing? Someone whispered behind Keiko. She is dead. Let her rest. But Hayes ignored them. His other hand went to Hana's wrist, feeling for something. His head bent close to her face, listening. Seconds stretched. The women held their collective breath, not understanding what he was looking for, knowing only that something in the room had shifted. Then Hayes's eyes widened, his face transformed. There it is. Faint, but there. She has got a pulse. He looked up at the nurse hovering behind him. American woman, white uniform, competent hands. Get the oxygen. Get the adrenaline. Now, the nurse moved instantly. No questions, just action. Grabbing equipment from a nearby cart, other medical personnel appeared. The room that had been a place of mourning became suddenly a place of frantic activity. But we checked. Tomoko's voice, stunned, almost broken. There was no pulse. She was not breathing. Hayes glanced at her for just a second. His hands never stopped moving over Hannah's body. Weak pulse, shallow breathing. In a severely weakened patient, it can be almost impossible to detect without the right tools. I have seen it before. She is not gone yet. But she will be if we do not work fast. The women were ushered out, guided firmly but not unkindly toward the door. They went, stumbling, confused, suspended in a strange space between grief and hope. The door closed behind them. They stood in the hallway, silent, listening to muffled voices, the sounds of medical equipment, the rhythm of emergency. Keiko stood with her back against the wall. Her legs felt weak. Her mind could not process what had just happened. They had said goodbye, had mourned, had accepted that Hannah was gone. And now this American doctor was telling them they were wrong, that there was still a chance. She looked at her hands. They were shaking. She pressed them flat against the cool wall, tried to steady herself, Tried to understand. Why would he fight so hard? Why would an American doctor fight to save a Japanese prisoner? What did it mean? 3 months earlier, September 1945, San Francisco Harbor. The military transport ship approached the dock with the sun beating down on dark water. Heat shimmered off the surface, made the city beyond look like something from a dream. Unreal, distant, dangerous. On the lower deck, 127 Japanese women pressed against the railing. They wore a strange mix of clothing, some still in the torn remains of military auxiliary uniforms, others in civilian dresses that had seen too many washings, all of it wrinkled and salt-stained from weeks at sea. Keiko Tanaka stood near the center of the group, 23 years old, small frame, dark eyes that had once held certainty but now held only exhaustion. She gripped the railing with one hand. The other clutched a small cloth bundle, everything she owned in the world, a wooden comb, a faded photograph of her parents standing in front of their Tokyo home before the bombs came, a diary she had managed to keep hidden through the chaos of surrender and capture. She had worked as a translator at a military headquarters in Saipan, had believed every word of the propaganda, had trusted that Japan would win, that the Americans were weak and corrupt and would collapse under sustained pressure. She had been wrong about all of it, and now she was here, a prisoner of war, waiting to learn what that would mean. Around her, the other women showed the same exhaustion, the same fear. The youngest was Hana Watanabe, barely 17, a radio operator with a sheltered upbringing who had never left Japan before the war. She stood close to Keiko now, trembling visibly. An older woman had her arm around the girl's shoulders, whispering comfort that Keiko could not quite hear. Further down the rail stood Tomoko Nakamura, 52, former army nurse, widow. She had lost her husband to the Russians in Manchuria in 1939, had served through the war with the kind of grim determination that came from having nothing left to lose. Her face now showed no emotion, but her eyes were alert, watching everything, trusting nothing. The ship's engines rumbled into silence. Ropes flew through the air. American dock workers in worn clothes shouted to each other in English. The casual loudness of their voices sent tension rippling through the women. For months they had been told stories. Americans were barbarians. They showed no mercy to prisoners, especially not to women. The propaganda had painted images of degradation and death that haunted their dreams. But what hit them first was not violence. It was a smell. Bread, fresh bread baking somewhere in the city beyond the docks. The scent drifted across the water, mixed with salt air and diesel fumes. For women who had survived on rice balls and seaweed for months, who had watched rations dwindle as the war turned against Japan. That smell was almost painful. Keiko closed her eyes, let the scent wash over her. For just a moment, she was transported. Back to a bakery in Tokyo before the war. When such smells were common, when the world made sense, the memory cut like a blade. A woman beside her whispered, "It is a trick. They want us to smell it, to make the hunger worse." Others murmured agreement. Even kindness could be a weapon. They had learned that much. The sounds were equally disorienting. Seagulls cried overhead, their calls mixing with the shouts of dock workers, the rumble of truck engines, the distant clang of a streetcar. But what struck Keiko most was the tone. The American voices were not harsh, not cruel, just ordinary men calling to each other about lunch plans, about baseball scores, about someone's new car. It was the casual normalcy of a world that had not been bombed into rubble. Visually, the contrast was even sharper. The women had left behind the destroyed remains of Saipan, where American bombs had turned buildings to dust and jungles to ash. They had sailed past islands where palm trees stood as blackened skeletons. But here the buildings rose intact against blue soil. Windows gleamed unbroken. Cars moved through streets, civilian cars. The Golden Gate Bridge stretched in the distance, a monument to engineering and peace. It was a world where war had not touched the homeland, and that fact alone said something about who had won and who had lost. The women stood frozen as American soldiers in clean uniforms began boarding the ship. Military police with white armbands, pistols holstered at their sides. They moved up the gangway with practiced efficiency. The women pressed closer together instinctively. A protective huddle. Hana began trembling harder. The older woman holding her whispered something urgent in her ear. Be brave. We face this together. The lead soldier stopped a few feet from the group. He looked them over. His expression was unreadable. Professional. The women waited for the first blow, the first insult, the first sign of the cruelty they had been promised. Instead, he pulled a clipboard from under his arm, spoke in a flat, bureaucratic voice that somehow made everything more surreal. We are going to process you for transport to the detention facility. You will be given medical checks, documentation, temporary quarters, follow the instructions of the guards, and there will not be any problems. A woman stepped forward, Japanese-American, military uniform, translator. Her accent was American, which made some of the prisoners distrust her immediately, but her face showed something unexpected. Sympathy. She looked at them not with hatred, but with sadness, as if their situation hurt her personally. Keiko found herself studying the translator's face, trying to reconcile what she saw with what she had been taught. This woman was Japanese by blood, yet wore an American uniform. She had chosen the enemy's side, but she did not look cruel, did not look like a traitor. She looked tired, perhaps heartbroken, but human. It was the first crack in the wall of certainty Keiko had built around herself. The women were led down the gangway in a double line, guards on either side. They walked slowly, their legs weak from weeks at sea. The dock stretched before them, solid ground after so long on water. When Keiko's feet touched the pier, she felt a wave of emotion she could not name. Relief, fear, grief, and all mixed together into something that made her throat tight. As they walked, civilians stopped to watch. Americans stood at a safe distance, pointing, whispering to each other. Some faces showed curiosity, others showed anger. One woman spat on the ground as they passed. Keiko understood that hatred. She had seen what war did, had heard about Pearl Harbor, about American soldiers killed in the Pacific. She had expected much worse than a look of disgust. Yet even that look cut deeper than she thought it would. To be seen as the enemy, to be hated by strangers, was different from hearing about it in propaganda. It was personal and immediate and real. They were loaded into covered trucks, 20 women to a vehicle. The canvas sides blocked most of the view, but through gaps, Keiko caught glimpses of San Francisco passing by. Buildings taller than anything in Tokyo stood undamaged. Shop windows displayed goods, shoes, dresses, canned foods in quantities that seemed impossible. Children rode bicycles on sidewalks. It was a world that did not match anything they had been told about the enemy. One woman voiced what others were thinking. Maybe it is just this city. Maybe they are hiding the damage from us. But even as she said it, doubt crept into her voice. If America was struggling as Japanese radio had claimed, if the war had drained their resources, why did the cities look so prosperous? Why did civilians look so well-fed? The contradiction gnawed at them. The detention facility was located an hour outside the city, a cluster of wooden barracks surrounded by chain-link fences, barbed wire coiled along the top. Guard towers stood at the corners, soldiers with rifles visible in each. It looked like a prison, which is what it was. But as the trucks passed through the gates and the women got their first full view, they noticed things that did not fit their expectations. The grounds were swept clean, grass grew between the barracks, green and maintained. There were no signs of decay or deliberate cruelty in the camp's construction. It was orderly, almost clinical. This was not the hellish prison they had prepared themselves for. It was something else entirely. Efficient, organized, impersonal. The women were led to a processing building. Inside they found white-painted walls, clean floors, the sharp smell of antiseptic. Medical personnel in white coats moved between stations. The translator explained that each woman would receive a medical examination, would have her information recorded, would be issued clean clothing. This was the moment many had feared most. Medical examinations could mean humiliation, violation, degradation. The women stood in line, silent, intense, each imagining the worst. When Keiko's turn came, she followed a female nurse into a curtained area. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She had heard stories. Terrible stories about what happened to women prisoners. But the nurse was middle-aged, gray streaking her hair, professional demeanor. She gestured for Keiko to sit on an examination table. Through the translator, the nurse explained each step, checking temperature, blood pressure, listening to heart and lungs, examining for obvious illness or injury. The nurse's hands were gentle. Her eyes were professional but not unkind. When she found the bruises on Keiko's ribs from a fall during the chaotic evacuation of Saipan, she made notes, but asked no questions that implied judgment. At the end of the examination, the nurse handed Keiko a small paper cup, 2 white pills inside, vitamins. The translator's voice. Many of you are malnourished. These will help. Keiko stared at the pills. This was kindness, or it was poison, or it was something she did not have the framework to understand. She swallowed them because refusal seemed more dangerous than compliance. After medical checks came the part that felt most vulnerable. The women were led to shower facilities, told to remove their clothing for delousing. This was it, many thought. This was where the humiliation would begin. They filed into a large tiled room. Shower heads lined the walls. Female guards supervised, but they stood back. Not crowding, not leering. They handed out bars of soap, real soap, white and fragrant, and thin towels. When Keiko turned on the shower, hot water poured out. She gasped at the heat, the shock of it. Around her, other women made similar sounds of surprise. For months, they had bathed in cold water when they could bathe at all. They had scrubbed with sand and salt water. This hot water, this real soap, felt almost sinful in its comfort. Keiko stood under the spray, let it wash away layers of grime, sweat, fear. The soap lathered thick and white. It smelled like flowers, a scent so at odds with everything she had experienced that her throat tightened with emotions she could not name. Around her, some women wept quietly, whether from relief or confusion or the simple release of finally being clean, she could not tell. Perhaps it was all three. When they emerged, they were given clean clothes, not prison uniforms in any degrading sense, but simple dresses and undergarments. The fabric was clean, unpatched, sized appropriately. A guard pointed to bins where they could store personal belongings. Everything would be cataloged and kept safe, the translator assured them. Clean and dressed, the women were led to the mess hall. The building was simple but well-maintained. Long tables with attached benches ran the length of the room. At one end, a serving line had been set up. Steam rose from metal containers. The smell hit them before they even entered. Cooked rice, vegetables, some kind of meat, real food, hot food, more food than they had seen in months. They formed a line automatically, years of military discipline making the movement instinctive. As they shuffled forward, Keiko could see the servers, American soldiers in aprons, wielding large serving spoons. Each woman received a metal tray divided into sections. Into these sections went a mound of white rice, steamed carrots and peas, a piece of baked chicken, a slice of bread with a pat of butter. Keiko accepted her tray with both hands. It was heavy. The rice alone was more than she had eaten in a day for the past month. She carried it to a table where Hana and several others had already sat. They stared at their trays in silence. Around the room, the same scene repeated. Women sitting motionless, looking at food they could not quite believe was meant for them. Maybe it is drugged. Someone whispered, maybe they poison only this first meal to make it easier to dispose of us. The fear was real, palpable, but so was the hunger. One by one, the women began to eat. Keiko picked up her fork. They had been given forks, not chopsticks, but she managed. She tried a small bite of rice. It was perfectly cooked, slightly sticky, real rice without the husks and dirt that had filled the last bags they had received in Saipan. She tried the chicken next. The meat was tender, seasoned with salt and herbs. Fat and moisture met her tongue. Tastes her body had nearly forgotten. She had to stop herself from eating too fast, from making herself sick. Around her, other women faced the same struggle. Some ate slowly, savoring every bite. Others devoured their food with desperate speed, as if afraid it might be taken away. Hana began to cry quietly as she ate. Tears ran down her cheeks, dripping onto her tray. But she did not stop eating. An older woman beside her reached over and squeezed her hand. No words were needed. They all felt it. The overwhelming confusion of being fed well by those they had been taught to see as monsters. When Keiko finished, her stomach felt uncomfortably full. She could not remember the last time she had experienced that sensation. A guard walked through the mess hall with a pitcher, offering to refill water glasses. Water glasses. They had been given glass cups, not tin cans or dirty bowls. The small details accumulated, each one chipping away at the certainty they had carried with them from Japan. That night, lying in her bunk in the women's barracks, Keiko pulled out her diary, wrote by the dim light of a single bulb that hung from the ceiling. Today, we were processed as prisoners. We were given soap that smells of flowers, hot water that feels like luxury, food that makes us weep. I do not understand this enemy. I do not understand what they want from us. Is kindness a strategy, or have we been lied to about who they are? I am afraid to believe it is the latter, because that would mean everything that I thought I knew was false. The barracks that would house them were long wooden buildings. Rows of bunk beds lined both walls. Each woman was assigned a bed, a thin mattress, a pillow, 2 wool blankets. By prison standards, it was almost comfortable. By the standards of what they had been led to expect, it was incomprehensible. The barracks had working heaters for when the temperature dropped. There were windows that could open for fresh air. At one end of each building stood a small common area, a few chairs and a table. The Americans had even provided some books in Japanese. Old novels, poetry collections. Where they had obtained these, no one knew. That first night, the women lay in their bunks and whispered to each other in the darkness. Conversations mixed hope with fear, confusion with cautious relief. Above Keiko's bunk, Tomoko murmured, "My husband was captured by the Russians in Manchuria. I wonder if they feed him like this. I wonder if he is alive at all." Below her, Hana whispered back, "Do you think they treat us well because we are women, or because Americans are different from what we were told?" No one had an answer. The question hung in the air, unanswered and troubling. Outside, guards patrolled the perimeter. The sound of their boots on gravel punctuated the night. But they did not shout threats. They did not bang on the barracks walls to frighten the prisoners. They simply walked their routes, professional and distant. Even their restraint felt like a message, though what that message meant the women could not yet decode. In the days that followed, a pattern emerged. Each morning began with a bell at 6:30. The women rose, washed in communal bathrooms that had running water and actual sinks. Dressed in the simple clothes provided by the camp, breakfast was served at 7. Oatmeal or rice porridge, toast, sometimes eggs, always coffee or tea. The portions were generous. No one went hungry. After breakfast came work assignments. Some women were assigned to the camp laundry, washing and pressing linens. Others worked in the kitchen, preparing meals under the supervision of American cooks. A few with English skills were asked to help in the camp administration office, translating documents, organizing files. Keiko was assigned to library detail. The camp had a small library that served both guards and prisoners. She spent her mornings organizing books, checking them in and out, keeping the reading room tidy. It was quiet work, almost peaceful. She had time to think, perhaps too much time. The women were paid for their work, not much, just a few dollars a week in camp scrip, but paid nonetheless. The camp had a canteen where this scrip could be used to buy small luxuries. Chocolate bars, cigarettes, writing paper, stamps, toiletries. The first time Keiko held a Hershey's chocolate bar in her hand, she stared at it for a full minute before carefully unwrapping the brown paper. The chocolate was sweet, almost too sweet, and it melted on her tongue. It was a small thing, but it felt like evidence of a world that still had room for sweetness. One afternoon in the library, a young American soldier came in. He could not have been more than 20. Off duty, wearing casual clothes, he browsed the shelves with the unself-conscious comfort of someone who loved reading. Keiko was shelving books nearby, trying to be invisible as prisoners learned to be. But he noticed her and nodded politely. "Good afternoon." His Japanese was terrible, heavily accented and grammatically broken. But he had tried. Keiko was so surprised she forgot to be cautious. "Good afternoon," she replied in English, her own accent marking her, but her grammar correct. The soldier smiled. "You speak English?" Keiko nodded. "I was a translator. That must be useful here." It was a simple exchange, maybe 3 minutes total, but it stuck with Keiko for days. He had spoken to her like a person, not an enemy. The distinction felt enormous. Late one afternoon, Keiko was organizing returned books when she saw him. Dr. Benjamin Hayes, camp physician, he had come to browse the medical text, looking for something specific. He moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who knew what he wanted. Keiko had seen him before, making rounds, treating minor ailments. He was 43. Gray touched his temples. His face carried a weariness that went deeper than physical exhaustion. She had heard whispers about him, that he had lost someone in the war, that he volunteered for POW medical duty when most doctors avoided it. She watched him from behind her cart of books, noticed how his hands lingered on certain volumes, how his jaw tightened when he found what he was looking for. A text on infectious diseases. He checked it out without speaking, gave her a brief nod, and left. It was nothing. A moment of no consequence. But Keiko found herself thinking about it later, about the weight he seemed to carry, about what it cost him to be here, treating enemy prisoners when he had his own grief to process. The real test of the camp's character came not from grand gestures, but from the accumulation of small moments. The cook who showed Hannah how to make American-style biscuits and laughed when her first attempt came out hard as rocks. The guard who shared his cigarettes with women working in the garden. The medic who sat with an elderly prisoner suffering from arthritis, patiently explaining how to use the heating pad he had provided. These were not dramatic displays of kindness. They were ordinary human interactions, the kind that happened when people worked together. But for women who had been taught that Americans were monsters, each interaction was a revelation. Each one made it harder to maintain the careful distance between captor and captive. Yet the relative comfort of the camp existed in painful contrast to the news from home. Through carefully controlled channels, letters took months to arrive. Through news broadcasts in Japanese that the camp allowed them to hear, they learned of Japan's devastation. Tokyo had been firebombed until entire neighborhoods ceased to exist. Hiroshima and Nagasaki had been destroyed by weapons the women could barely comprehend. Millions were homeless, starving, desperate. Letters from family members, when they came, painted pictures of hunger and loss. Keiko received a letter from her younger sister in late October. The paper was thin, almost translucent, rationed and precious. Her sister wrote in a careful hand, "Mother is ill, but there is no medicine. We eat sweet potato leaves and watered-down miso. Father's factory was destroyed in the bombing. He searches for work, but there is nothing. We are grateful you are alive, even as a prisoner. At least you eat. At least you are warm." Keiko read the letter 3 times, then folded it carefully and put it under her pillow. That night at dinner, she looked at the food on her tray, a slice of meatloaf, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread with butter, and felt physically sick with guilt. Her family was starving while she ate meat. The enemy was feeding her better than her own country ever had. She was not alone in this feeling. Across the barracks, similar scenes played out. Women read letters from home and wept. They felt the weight of survival pressing down on them like a physical force. Some stopped eating as much, trying to save food even though they knew it would just be thrown away. Not sent to Japan, others ate with mechanical efficiency, divorcing themselves from the emotional reality of the act. Outside, palm trees swayed in warm wind. Inside, 127 Japanese women tried to sleep, tried to understand, tried to reconcile what they had expected with what they had received. Keiko's last thought before sleep claimed her was simple and terrible and absolutely certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. The days settled into a rhythm that felt almost normal. Almost. That was perhaps the most unsettling part. The way routine could make the impossible seem ordinary. The way the human mind adapted even to circumstances that should have remained strange. Each morning the bell rang at 6:30. The women rose, moved through the rituals of washing and dressing with the practiced efficiency of people who had learned to function on autopilot. Breakfast at 7, work assignments that filled the hours, lunch at noon, more work, dinner at 6, then the long evenings in the barracks where thoughts could not be kept at bay. Keiko spent her mornings in the library. The work was simple, shelving books, checking them in and out, maintaining a log of what was borrowed and by whom. Sometimes she would open a book at random, read a few pages in English, let herself get lost in stories that had nothing to do with their defeat or the moral complexities of being fed well by the enemy. The library was quiet, a refuge. The only sounds were the rustle of pages, the scratch of her pen in the logbook, occasionally footsteps as someone entered or left. It gave her space to think, to process, to try to understand what was happening to her. Because something was happening, some fundamental shift in the way she saw the world. It crept up slowly, so gradually that she did not notice until it had already changed her. Small moments accumulated into a weight that pressed against her certainty, made it harder to maintain the clear lines between us and them, between enemy and human. In the kitchen, Hannah worked alongside American cooks, learning to make biscuits and cornbread and other foods she had never tasted before the war. The head cook was a man named Sergeant Miller, 40 years old, from somewhere called Nebraska. He had infinite patience with Hannah's mistakes, would demonstrate a technique over and over without frustration. Sometimes he would make jokes that Hannah did not understand, but she would smile anyway, and he would smile back. And for those brief moments, the war felt very far away. Tomoko had been assigned to the infirmary. Her nursing experience made her valuable. Dr. Hayes supervised her work, showed her where supplies were kept, explained American medical procedures that differed from what she had learned in Japan. He was professional, thorough, showed no favoritism, treated American soldiers and Japanese prisoners with identical care. She watched him closely, this man who had every reason to hate them, who treated their illnesses with the same focus he applied to his own countrymen. She looked for cracks in the facade, for moments when his true feelings might show. But all she saw was a doctor doing his job, competently, almost obsessively, as if the work itself was what mattered, not the nationality of the patient. It confused her more than cruelty would have. The women were paid for their work, a few dollars each week in camp scrip. The first time Keiko held the paper bills in her hand, she felt a strange disconnect. Prisoners of war, being paid wages, allowed to spend money at a canteen that sold chocolate and cigarettes and soap and writing supplies. The canteen became a strange space, a place where captors and captives mingled in the act of commerce, where an American guard might stand in line behind a Japanese prisoner, both buying the same chocolate bar, both human in their small wants. Keiko bought a Hershey bar her first week, unwrapped it slowly, let the chocolate melt on her tongue. The sweetness was almost painful. It reminded her of a world before war, before hunger became a constant companion, before every bite of food came with a side of guilt. The accumulation of small kindnesses was more destabilizing than any cruelty could have been. It would have been easier to hate, easier to maintain the clear divisions. But kindness demanded something more complicated. It demanded acknowledgement, recognition, the uncomfortable truth that the enemy was human too. One afternoon in early November, Keiko was shelving books in the history section. A shadow fell across the cart. She looked up to see an American soldier, young, maybe 22. He wore the casual clothes of someone off duty. His eyes were kind. "Excuse me," he said in careful Japanese. "Do you have books about Japan?" Keiko blinked in surprise. His pronunciation was terrible, but the effort was clear. He was trying, actually trying to speak her language. Yes, she switched to English. "Over here." She led him to a small section. Books about Japanese history, culture, literature, most in English, a few in Japanese. He browsed slowly, selected a book about the Meiji Restoration, thanked her, left. The entire interaction lasted maybe 5 minutes, but Keiko could not stop thinking about it. Why would an American soldier want to read about Japanese history? What was he trying to understand? Later, she realized, he was trying to understand them, to see beyond the propaganda, to find the humanity underneath the enemy label. It was a gift she had not known she needed. This evidence that curiosity could survive hatred, that some people still wanted to bridge the gap. In the kitchen, Sergeant Miller showed Hannah how to make biscuits for the third time. She kept getting the consistency wrong. Too much water and too little. The dough either crumbled or turned to paste. On her latest attempt, the biscuits came out of the oven hard as stones. Miller picked one up, tapped it against the counter. It made a solid thunk. He looked at Hannah. his face serious. Then suddenly he smiled, laughed, not mockingly but with genuine amusement. "Well," he said through the translator who helped in the kitchen, "if we run out of ammunition, we have a backup plan now." Hannah stared at him, not sure how to respond. Then, despite herself, she felt her own smile forming. The absurdity of it. A Japanese prisoner of war and an American sergeant laughing together over failed biscuits. It should not have been possible. Yet here they were. Miller showed her again. Demonstrated the right ratio of ingredients, the proper way to fold the dough. This time when they came out of the oven, they were golden brown, flaky, perfect. Hannah held one in her hand, felt the warmth of it, the proof that she could learn, that she could create something good even in this place. "Thank you," she said quietly in English. Miller nodded. "You did the work. I just showed you how." But they both knew it was more than that. It was a small act of faith. The belief that teaching mattered, that growth was possible, that even prisoners deserved to learn new skills. In the infirmary, Tomoko changed bandages on a young American soldier. He had been injured in training, nothing serious, just a sprained wrist and some bruised ribs. But he was in pain, trying to hide it, trying to be tough. Dr. Hayes examined him, asked questions, prescribed rest and ice and pain medication. His manner was brisk but not unkind. When he finished, he turned to Tomoko, asked her to make sure the soldier followed the instructions. To check on him tomorrow. The soldier looked at Tomoko, really looked at her, seeing her perhaps for the first time as a person rather than a category. A prisoner. The enemy. Japanese. He seemed to be struggling with something. Finally, he spoke. "Thank you," just 2 words. But his tone carried weight, sincerity, recognition. Tomoko nodded, said nothing. What was there to say? She was doing her job, following Hayes' instructions. But also she cared, despite herself, despite everything. She did not want this young American to suffer unnecessarily. The realization disturbed her. Later that evening, Tomoko found Hayes in his office, going through patient files, making notes. She knocked on the open door. He looked up, gestured for her to enter. "The young soldier," she said, "the one with the sprained wrist. Why did you ask me to care for him?" "You have American nurses." Hayes set down his pen, looked at her thoughtfully. "You are a good nurse. You know what you are doing. Why should his nationality matter? Or yours? But I am the enemy. You are a medical professional. In this building, that is what matters most." Tomoko stood in silence, processing his words. Finally, she spoke again. "Your son, you lost him in the war." Hayes' face tightened, just for a moment. Then the professional mask returned. "Yes, and yet you treat us, the Japanese, without anger, without revenge." How Hayes was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was low, tired. Because anger changes nothing. Revenge brings no one back. But healing matters. It is the only thing I can control, the only choice I have that makes sense. He looked at her directly then, his eyes carrying a weight she recognized. The weight of loss that never fully lifts, only becomes bearable with time. "My son wanted to be a doctor. Like me, he never got the chance, so I do this. I heal. Because that is what he would have wanted. Because that is how I honor him. Not with hatred, but with the work he dreamed of doing." Tomoko felt something shift in her chest, some hard knot of anger she had carried for years, since her husband had been taken from her. Since the war had stolen so much, it did not dissolve, but it loosened, just a little. "I understand," she said quietly. Hayes nodded, picked up his pen again, returned to his notes. The conversation was over, but something had changed between them. Some recognition had passed. 2 people on opposite sides, both grieving, both choosing to heal rather than to harm. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. Maybe never. But it was understanding, and that alone felt like a kind of miracle. The letters from Japan came in waves, delivered by military mail, thin envelopes with addresses written in familiar hands, each one a connection to a world that felt increasingly distant, each one a reminder of what was being lost while they lived in relative comfort. Keiko received her second letter in mid-November, from her mother this time. The handwriting was shaky, less controlled than usual, the paper even thinner than the last, as if Japan was running out of everything. even the means to communicate. Her mother wrote about the cold, how winter was coming and they had no heat, about the hunger that was a constant companion now, about neighbors who had died, just stopped existing, worn down by deprivation and grief and the accumulated weight of defeat. She wrote about how they thought of Keiko constantly, hoped she was well, hoped the Americans were not too cruel. At least you survived, her mother wrote. That is what matters. You survived, and perhaps someday you will come home and we will rebuild together. Keiko read the letter 3 times, then pressed it against her chest, felt tears slide down her face, silent and hot. She wanted to scream, wanted to shake her mother and tell her the truth, that the Americans were not cruel, that they fed her 3 meals a day, that she had chocolate and soap that smelled like flowers and a warm bed and all the things her mother was suffering without. But she could not write that, could not admit it. Because what kind of daughter would that make her? What kind of Japanese woman would feel grateful to the enemy while her family starved? Around the barracks, similar scenes played out. Women reading letters, weeping, trying to process the guilt of survival, the shame of comfort, the impossible weight of being well-fed while their loved ones suffered. That evening at dinner, Keiko looked at her tray, roasted chicken, mashed potatoes swimming in gravy, green beans, a roll with butter, chocolate pudding for dessert. She picked up her fork, put it down, could not bring herself to eat. Across from her, Hana stared at her own food, her face pale, haunted. My mother wrote, Hana said quietly, they are eating grass. She did not specify what kind, just grass, to fill their stomachs with something, anything. Keiko closed her eyes. The mess hall felt too bright, too warm, too comfortable. Around them, American soldiers ate and talked and laughed, living their lives. While half a world away, people starved in the ruins of what had been Japan. How can we eat this? Hana's voice was breaking. How can we sit here and eat while they suffer because we have no choice? Tomoko's voice, firm, coming from the end of the table. Because refusing to eat helps no one, changes nothing. We survive. That is what we can do. Survive and go home when they let us, and help rebuild. But Hana was crying now. Quiet tears that she did not try to hide. It feels like betrayal. Every bite feels like I am choosing them over my family, over Japan. You did not choose this, Keiko heard herself say. We were captured. Prisoners do not choose their circumstances. We endure them. But the words felt hollow even as she spoke them, because the truth was more complicated. They were not just enduring, they were adapting, becoming comfortable, starting to see their captors as humans rather than monsters. And that felt like the deepest betrayal of all. That night, after lights out, the barracks hummed with whispered conversations. Women processing their guilt, their confusion, their slowly changing understanding of the world. Someone mentioned that the camp library had American newspapers for those who could read English. The younger women wanted to know what the papers said about Japan, about the war, about what would happen next. It is propaganda, an older woman said firmly. They want us to believe Japan was wrong, that we deserved what happened. We cannot trust enemy newspapers. But Hana surprised them all by speaking up, her voice small but determined. If American newspapers are propaganda, she said, were not Japanese newspapers propaganda too? Somebody lied to us. Maybe both sides lied. Maybe everyone lied. The statement hung in the darkness, simple but devastating. If both sides had lied, then truth became complicated, messy, impossible to locate. It meant they could not trust anything they had been told. Not by Japan, not by America, not by anyone. Keiko found herself speaking before she could stop herself. They treat us well here, better than we expected, better than our own army treated us toward the end, if we are honest. Does that make them good or just practical? I do not know anymore. I do not know what to believe. Her voice cracked on the last sentence, all the careful control she had maintained since capture finally fracturing. The admission felt dangerous, like she was crossing a line she could not uncross. Silence followed, heavy and uncomfortable. Then slowly others began to speak, confessing their own doubts, their own confusions. One woman admitted she had smiled at a guard's joke, had felt guilty about it for days. Another said she looked forward to meals, not just for the food, but for the brief conversations with the kitchen staff. A third confessed she had been thinking about what it would be like to stay in America. Because what did she have to go home to? What future waited in the ruins? These were dangerous admissions. Even among prisoners, there was fear of being seen as a traitor, of betraying the group by admitting what many privately felt. But once the first confession was made, others followed. As if permission had been granted to speak the unspeakable. The debate went on for hours, voices rising and falling in the darkness. Some women defended Japan fiercely, insisted the propaganda about Americans had been true, that this comfort was temporary, a trick. Others argued that they needed to face reality, that they had been lied to, that the war had been wrong from the start. No consensus emerged, but something shifted, some acknowledgement that the world was more complicated than they had been taught. That certainty itself might be the enemy. That truth was harder to find than anyone wanted to admit. In late November, a new tension entered the camp. An American holiday approached. Thanksgiving. Something about gratitude and harvest and family. The prisoners did not fully understand it, but they knew it meant something to their captors. On Thanksgiving Day, the mess hall was decorated. Paper turkeys, autumn leaves, corn stalks. The Americans had put effort into making it festive, as if celebrating mattered even in a prison camp, perhaps especially in a prison camp. The meal was elaborate. Turkey with stuffing, mashed potatoes, gravy, cranberry sauce, green beans, rolls with butter, pumpkin pie. It was more food than Keiko had seen on one plate in her entire life. The portions were generous to the point of absurdity. The women sat with their trays, staring at the abundance. Around them, American soldiers ate and talked and seemed genuinely happy, as if this meal meant something important to them, as if tradition could exist even here, even now. Keiko picked up her fork, looked at the turkey, thought about her mother eating grass, about her sister searching for work that did not exist, about her father wandering through the ruins of Tokyo looking for something to salvage. She put the fork down, stood abruptly, walked out of the mess hall. Outside, the air was cool. The California winter mild compared to what she remembered from Tokyo, but cold enough to make her shiver. She wrapped her arms around herself, tried to breathe normally, failed. Footsteps behind her. She turned to see Hana. The girl's face was wet with tears. "I cannot," Hana sobbed. "I cannot eat that while my mother starves. I cannot tell her about this. She will think I betrayed her. Betrayed Japan. Betrayed everything." Keiko pulled her close, held her while she cried, had no words of comfort to offer. Because Hana was right. How could they tell their families about the chocolate, about the hot showers, about being treated with basic human dignity by the enemy? How could they explain being grateful for it? "We did not choose this," Keiko said finally. "We did not choose to be captured. We did not choose to be fed well. But we are grateful for it." Hana pulled back, looked at her with red eyes. "That is the betrayal. We are grateful to the enemy. We are starting to see them as human. And that feels like we are losing ourselves. Maybe we are not losing ourselves," Keiko said slowly. "Maybe we are finding out who we really are. Without the propaganda, without the lies, just us, just human." But Hana just shook her head, cried harder, and Keiko held her, because there were no good answers, no way to reconcile the impossible position they found themselves in. Surviving comfortably while their nation died, being treated well by those they had been taught to hate, living in a world that made no sense. The days after Thanksgiving felt different, heavier, as if the abundance of that meal had made the guilt impossible to ignore. The women went through their routines, but something had shifted. Some final resistance had crumbled. They could no longer pretend that the Americans were monsters, could no longer maintain the comfortable fiction that they were suffering nobly. They were prisoners, yes, but comfortable prisoners. And that reality was harder to bear than any torture could have been. In the last week of November, Hannah began to seem different, tired, quieter than usual. She picked at her meals, left food on her tray. Several women noticed but did not comment. Grief affected appetite. They all had days when eating felt impossible. But when the morning bell rang and Hannah did not get up, when they called her name and she did not respond, when Tomoko checked her and found burning fever and shallow breathing, then they knew. This was not grief. This was illness, real and dangerous and immediate. Tomoko's face went pale as she examined the girl, felt her racing pulse, listened to her labored breathing. She is very sick, Tomoko said. Fever, rapid pulse, respiratory distress. We need help, now. The women looked at each other. They were prisoners. Would the Americans care? Would they provide real medical care? Or would they let Hana die? One less mouth to feed, one less problem to manage. Tomoko did not wait for discussion. She ran to find a guard, returned minutes later with 2 soldiers. They took one look at Hana, radioed immediately for the camp medic. Dr. Hayes arrived within minutes, knelt beside Hannah's bunk, took her temperature, checked her pulse, listened to her chest with his stethoscope. His face remained professionally neutral, but his movements were quick. Urgent. Pneumonia, he said to his assistant. Possibly severe. We need to move her to the infirmary immediately. They brought a stretcher, lifted Hana onto it with surprising gentleness. Her eyes fluttered open for just a moment, confused, frightened. Keiko grabbed her hand. You will be okay, she said in Japanese, not knowing if it was true, just needing to say it. Hana's hand was burning, the fever raging through her small body. Then they carried her away, moving quickly toward the medical building. The women stood in silence, watching her go, knowing that this was the test. This would show them who the Americans really were, whether the kindness was real or just a facade, whether Hana's life mattered to them, whether a Japanese prisoner's suffering would move them to action or be met with indifference. Keiko found she was praying. To God she was not sure she believed in anymore. To forces she could not name. Please, just please, let her live, let them care. Let this nightmare have at least one moment of grace. The hours that followed were the longest of Keiko's life. Longer than the days in Saipan waiting for the bombs. Longer than the weeks crossing the Pacific not knowing what awaited. Because this was different. This was personal. This was Hana, young and innocent and kind. This was hope itself hanging in the balance. Evening came. Tomoko was allowed to visit the infirmary. She returned with cautiously hopeful news. Hana was being treated with antibiotics, penicillin, the miracle drug. She had an IV providing fluids. Nurses checked on her constantly. Dr. Hayes was monitoring her personally. The women received this news in stunned silence. Penicillin. They were using penicillin on a Japanese prisoner. The drug was expensive, precious, reserved for the most important cases. Yet they were using it to save Hana, a girl with no strategic value, no importance, just a 17-year-old prisoner of war. What did it mean that they valued her life, that they saw her as human, that the kindness was real after all? Keiko did not know, could not process it. She lay in her bunk that night and stared at the ceiling, thinking about Hana fighting for her life in the infirmary, about Dr. Hayes fighting to save her, about what it meant that the enemy cared. Tomorrow would be the second day of Hana's illness. Tomorrow they would know if the treatment was working, if the fever would break, if the girl would survive. Tomorrow they would learn whether hope was justified, or just another cruel illusion in a world that seemed determined to break them in ways they had never imagined. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, making the barracks creak and groan. Inside, 126 women lay awake, praying for the one who was not with them, waiting for dawn, hoping for miracles. The second day of Hana's illness brought no relief. The fever persisted despite the antibiotics. The labored breathing continued. Tomoko was allowed brief visits to the infirmary. Each time she returned with reports that grew more concerning. The girl was declining. The treatment was not working fast enough. Time was running out. Keiko found she could not work, could not eat, could not focus on anything except the knowledge that Hana lay fighting for her life in a building she could not enter. She sat in the library with an open book in front of her. The words swam on the page, meaningless marks that her brain refused to process. Around the camp, the other women moved through their duties with the same distraction. The kitchen staff burned the rice, the laundry workers mixed colors with whites. Guards had to repeat instructions multiple times before anyone responded. It was as if the entire camp held its breath, waiting for news, hoping for a miracle. That night, Keiko could not sleep. She lay in her bunk staring at the empty bed below hers. Hana's bed. The blanket still rumpled from where she had lain fevered and struggling to breathe. The pillow still held the indent of her head, evidence of a life that might be ending even as Keiko lay there helpless. She thought about the girl who had cried while eating her first full meal, who had smiled when learning to make biscuits even though they came out hard as stones, who had been so young, so innocent, who had never hurt anyone, who deserved better than to die in a foreign land surrounded by enemies. Except they were not enemies anymore. Were they? That was what made this so painful. The lines had blurred, the categories had dissolved. Hana was not just a fellow prisoner. She was a friend. And the Americans were not just captors. They were people, some kind, some indifferent, but people, just people. Morning came with no news. The women went through breakfast mechanically. Keiko forced herself to eat, knew she needed strength, but the food tasted like dust and ashes in her mouth. Then around mid-morning came the sound that changed everything. Shouting, urgent voices, coming from the direction of the infirmary. Keiko abandoned her library card and ran. Other women appeared from various work details, all moving toward the commotion. Guards tried to hold them back but gave way when they saw the expressions on the women's faces. Grief already forming, dread becoming certainty. Through the open door of the medical building, they could see movement, people rushing, the organized chaos of emergency. But also something else, a stillness at the center. The kind of stillness that meant the worst had happened. Then Tomoko emerged. Her face was carved from stone, her eyes empty. She walked toward them slowly, each step seeming to cost her something. The women pressed forward, desperate for news, terrified of what she would say. Tomoko's voice when she spoke was barely a whisper, but in the awful silence it carried clearly. She stopped breathing. They could not find a pulse. She is gone. The words hit like physical blows. Several women began crying immediately. Others stood frozen. Keiko felt her legs weaken, felt the world tilt. No, no, this could not be happening. Not Hannah, not like this. Around her, the grief spread. Women who had maintained composure through capture and imprisonment now broke. Tears fell freely. Some women held each other, others stood alone, each processing the loss in their own way. The Americans had tried, had used their miracle drug, had fought to save her. But it had not been enough. The guard who had been holding them back hesitated, then stepped aside. "You can see her," he said through the translator. His voice was gentle, respectful. "You can say goodbye." The women filed into the infirmary in a silent procession, led to a small room where Hannah lay on a narrow bed, a white sheet drawn up to her chin. Her face was peaceful. The terrible tension of illness finally released. She looked younger than her 17 years, like a child sleeping, except she would not wake up. Keiko knelt beside the bed. Her knees hit the floor hard, but she did not feel it. Reached out with trembling hands and took Hannah's hand. It was already cooling, the heat of the fever that had consumed her now fading, replaced by the terrible cold that meant absence. That meant gone. She is gone. Someone sobbed behind her. The words were taken up, passed through the room like a litany. She is gone, she is gone. A dirge for a girl who had survived war and defeat and capture only to fall to something as ordinary as illness, as mundane as pneumonia. The unfairness of it was crushing. Keiko closed her eyes, let the tears come, did not try to hold them back or maintain dignity or preserve any illusion of strength. What was the point? What was any of it worth? They had thought they were learning to survive, learning to adapt, but survival meant nothing if it could be taken away this easily, this suddenly, this absolutely. Around her, the other women wept, some quietly, others with wrenching sobs. The sound filled the small room, overflowed into the hallway. The grief was physical, present, a weight that pressed down on all of them. Then footsteps, quick, urgent, moving against the current of mourning. "Wait, everyone wait! Do not move her!" Keiko's eyes snapped open. She turned to see Dr. Benjamin Hayes pushing through the grieving women, his face intense, almost desperate. He carried his medical bag and moved with singular purpose. Nothing else mattered. Nothing else existed except the body on the bed and whatever slim chance remained. "What is he doing?" Someone whispered. "She is dead. Let her rest." But Hayes was not listening. He reached the bed, set down his bag, pulled back the sheet that someone had carefully arranged, placed 2 fingers against Hannah's throat, pressed hard, harder than seemed necessary, as if he could will life back through force alone. His other hand went to her wrist, feeling for something, his face a mask of concentration. He bent his head close to her face, listening. Seconds passed, each one lasting an eternity. The women held their collective breath, not daring to hope, not able to fully surrender hope either. Then Hayes's eyes widened, his entire body changed, tension transforming into action. There. His voice was sharp, clear, certain. There it is, faint but there. She has got a pulse. He looked up at his nurse who had followed him into the room. Get the oxygen. Get the adrenaline. Now, move. The nurse did not hesitate, grabbed equipment from a cart in the hallway. Other medical personnel appeared. The small room that had been a place of mourning suddenly became a place of desperate action. Hands moving, voices calling, the organized chaos of emergency medicine. But we checked. Tomoko's voice, stunned, almost broken. There was no pulse. She was not breathing. We were certain. Hayes glanced at her for just a second. His hands never stopped working. Checking, adjusting, fighting, weak pulse, shallow breathing. In a severely weakened patient, almost impossible to detect without proper equipment. I have seen it before. She is not gone yet, but she will be if we do not work fast. The women were ushered out, guided firmly but not unkindly toward the hallway. They went, still crying. But the tears had changed, no longer pure grief, now mixed with something else. Confusion, disbelief, a cautious hope that felt too dangerous to embrace. They stood in the corridor, listening to muffled voices through the closed door, the sounds of equipment, the steady rhythm of emergency care. Minutes stretched into hours. No one could work. No one could leave. They waited, suspended between the death they had accepted and the life they did not dare believe in. Keiko stood with her back against the wall. Her mind could not process what had just happened. They had said goodbye, had mourned, had accepted that Hana was gone. And now this American doctor was telling them they were wrong, that there was still a chance, that the girl who had stopped breathing might yet live. Why would he fight so hard? The question circled endlessly. Why would an American doctor fight with such intensity to save a Japanese prisoner? A girl who represented the nation that had killed his son. An enemy who meant nothing strategically, nothing politically. Just one life among millions. Tomoko spoke quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Because he is a doctor. Because to him she is not Japanese or American or enemy or friend. She is a patient. And patients matter. Life matters. That is his oath. The only thing he believes in anymore. But his son, Keiko started, died because other people stopped seeing humans and saw only enemies. Tomoko's voice was firm. Hayes chooses differently, chooses to see the person, even when it costs him, especially when it costs him. That is his revenge against the war, to heal instead of harm, to save instead of destroy. The hours crawled by. Afternoon became evening. The women took turns sitting, standing, pacing. No one wanted to leave, as if their presence somehow mattered, as if their collective will could tip the balance toward life. Finally, as the sun was setting, then Hayes emerged. His face was drawn, exhausted, but his eyes held something that made Keiko's breath catch. Not defeat, not quite victory, but satisfaction, the deep satisfaction of work well done. She is stable, he said through the translator. The fever broke an hour ago. Her breathing is stronger. Her pulse is steady. She is not out of danger yet, but she is fighting, and I think she is going to make it. The relief was overwhelming, physical. Several women sank to the floor. Others embraced, crying again but differently. Joy mixed with exhaustion, mixed with disbelief. It was too much, the emotional whiplash from death to life, from grief to hope, from despair to gratitude. Tomoko approached Hayes, tears streaming down her weathered face. She spoke in broken English, her accent thick but her meaning clear. Thank you. Thank you for saving her. Thank you for caring. Hayes looked uncomfortable with the gratitude, shifted his weight, glanced away. It is my job. She is my patient. Of course I care. But Keiko understood that it was more than a job. He could have accepted their assessment, could have declared time of death and moved on. No one would have blamed him. She was an enemy prisoner, one of many. Her death would have changed nothing strategically. Instead, he had fought, had refused to give up, had searched for life when everyone else saw only death. And in doing so, he had saved more than just Hana. He had saved something in all of them, some last shred of faith that the world could still surprise them. That mercy could come from unexpected places, that humanity persisted even in the darkest circumstances. That night, the barracks hummed with quiet conversation. The near loss had shaken something loose, made the women confront truths they had been avoiding. They talked about what they had witnessed, what it meant, how it changed things. Keiko lay in her bunk and pulled out her diary, wrote by the dim light that hung from the ceiling. Today we learned that the enemy will fight to save us even when we have given up. Today we learned that to them we are not just bodies to be processed and contained, but lives worth saving. I do not know what to do with this knowledge. It breaks something in me. It breaks the neat categories of us and them, good and evil, victor and vanquished. If they can fight this hard to save Hana, what else have we been wrong about? What else is possible? Hana's recovery was slow. She spent 2 weeks in the infirmary, regaining strength, learning to breathe normally again. The women were allowed to visit in small groups. They brought her small gifts from the canteen: chocolate, writing paper, a comb for her hair, tokens of affection, proof that she was missed. When she was finally well enough to return to the barracks, the celebration was quiet but heartfelt. Women who rarely showed emotion embraced her. Others simply sat nearby, grateful for her presence. Her survival had become symbolic, evidence that not everything was lost, that sometimes the impossible happened. That hope was not always foolish, but even as they celebrated, new anxiety was growing. Rumors of repatriation circulated through the camp. The war was over. Japan had surrendered. Eventually they would be sent home. This should have been cause for joy, but instead it filled many of them with dread. What were they going home to? The letters painted pictures of devastation. Food was scarce, housing was scarce, work was scarce, and beyond the physical challenges were the emotional ones. How would they explain their time in American captivity? How would they describe being treated well by the enemy while their families suffered? Keiko found herself torn. She missed her family desperately, wanted to help them, to be with them, but she also dreaded leaving the relative safety of the camp. Here she ate regular meals. Here she had a warm bed. Here she had been treated with a dignity her own military had often denied. The guilt of these feelings was crushing. In early spring of 1946, the orders finally came. The women would be repatriated in phases, sent home by ship to various ports in Japan. They were given supplies for the journey: new clothes, basic toiletries, even food rations. The Americans were sending them home in better condition than they had arrived. On the last night before the first group was scheduled to leave, the women gathered in the barracks. Those leaving and those staying behind shared what little they had: the last pieces of chocolate, the final cigarettes. They talked about what they would tell people back home, how they would describe their time as prisoners. "I will tell the truth," Tomoko said firmly, "that we were treated according to the rules of war, that we were fed and housed and given medical care. If people think that makes us traitors, so be it. The truth is the truth." Others nodded, though some looked uncertain. In defeated Japan, such truce might be dangerous, might be seen as collaboration, as betrayal. Hana spoke quietly, still weak from her illness but determined. "I will tell them about Dr. Hayes, how he would not give up even when we had, how the enemy fought to save my life. Whatever else people need to know about the war, they need to know that." 2 weeks later, it was Keiko's turn. She packed her small bundle of possessions: a warm sweater, writing paper, a photograph one of the guards had taken of all the women together. She packed these carefully, knowing they represented not just objects but memories, evidence of a time that would seem unreal once she was home. The morning of departure, she was allowed to say goodbye to Dr. Hayes. He came to the assembly area where the women waited for transport, spoke briefly to each one. When he reached Keiko, he paused. "You speak English well. You will do well back home." "Thank you," Keiko said. her voice thick with emotion. For everything, for treating us like humans. That is all any of us deserve, Hayes replied. To be treated like humans. A pause, heavy with things unsaid. I am sorry, Keiko managed. About your son. Hayes's face tightened. Just for a moment. Then the professional mask returned. I know. And I am sorry about your country's losses too. All of it. All the death. Tomoko approached last. She handed Hayes something small. An origami crane, folded from paper she had saved. The Japanese tradition said 1,000 cranes could grant a wish. She had only one, but she offered it with both hands. For your son, she said through the translator. So he is remembered. Hayes accepted it. His hands trembled slightly. He could not speak, just nodded, tucked the crane carefully into his breast pocket, over his heart. The journey back across the Pacific was different from the journey over. The women were still prisoners in a sense, still under guard, but the atmosphere had changed. They were going home, whatever that meant, wherever that would lead. Tokyo in spring of 1946 was unrecognizable. Keiko stood on a hill overlooking what had been her neighborhood, saw only ruins, square miles of rubble, blackened foundations, the skeletal remains of buildings that had somehow stayed standing. She found her family living in a makeshift shelter, built from salvaged materials. Her mother looked decades older. Her father moved like a ghost through the wreckage. Her sister was too thin, eyes too large in her gaunt face. Her mother wept when she saw her, held her so tightly Keiko could barely breathe, asked where she had been, what had happened. Keiko told the truth, as much as she could, described the camp, the food, the treatment. Her mother listened in silence, face unreadable. Finally, she spoke. You were fortunate. Many were not so fortunate. But you survived and came home. Now we rebuild together. It was acceptance, not judgment. Keiko felt something in her chest loosen, some tension she had not known she was carrying. Over the following years, Keiko reconnected with some of the other women from the camp. Hana had returned to her village, married, had children. She told them about the American doctor who saved her life, about the strange months when the enemy showed mercy. Tomoko became a nurse again, working to rebuild Japan's medical system. She insisted on proper procedures, on treating all patients with dignity, remembering that rules mattered, that how you treated people mattered even when you had power over them. For Keiko, the experience transformed how she saw the world. She could never again accept simple narratives of good versus evil, us versus them. She had seen the enemy up close, found them to be complex, individual, capable of both great violence and great mercy. She kept her diary from those months, hidden but safe. Sometimes when the world seemed too certain of its divisions, she would take it out, read her own words from that time. The confusion, the guilt, the slow recognition that everything she thought she knew might be wrong. Years later, decades later, news reached Japan about Dr. Benjamin Hayes. He had continued POW medical work until 1947, returned to Virginia, practiced medicine until retirement in 1967. He died in 1978, age 76. His daughter found among his possessions a small origami crane, faded with time but carefully preserved, displayed on his desk for 32 years. A note was attached in his handwriting, a reminder that even enemies can show mercy, that even in war, humanity persists, that the most important thing we can do is choose to see each other as humans first. Keiko was 56 when she learned this, middle-aged now, a teacher herself, working to educate the next generation. She sat in her small apartment in Tokyo, held the letter that had brought the news, thought about a man she had known for only a few months, who had fought to save a girl who meant nothing strategically, everything humanly. She wrote one final entry in her old diary. The pages yellowed with age, the binding cracked, but the words still clear. We came to that camp expecting death or degradation. We found instead a different kind of defeat, the defeat of our certainties, our hatreds, our simple stories about who we were and who they were. Dr. Hayes taught us that the enemy could be kind, that mercy could come from unexpected sources, that the most dangerous weapon might be the one that challenges everything you believe. He is gone now, but what he taught us remains. The truth he lived, that even in the darkest times, humanity can persist, that even when we have every reason to hate, we can choose to heal instead. That is his legacy, not just to us, but to everyone who hears this story. She closed the diary, looked at the photograph from 1946, 127 Japanese women and their American guards, standing together on the last day of the camp, some smiling, some solemn, all of them human, evidence of the impossible made real. Her grandchildren came to visit that evening. They asked, as they always did, about the war, about what it was like. She had told them pieces before, but tonight she told them everything. The fear, the guilt, the transformation, the moment when they thought Hannah was dead and Hayes brought her back to life. Were the Americans cruel to you, grandmother? Her youngest grandchild asked. Keiko paused, considered the question carefully. No, they were kind. That was harder. The child looked confused. She explained. Cruelty would have confirmed what we believed. Kindness forced us to question everything, to see them as people, to recognize that we had been lied to. That is a devastation of its own kind. She pulled out the diary. Read them the final entry from the camp. We came here expecting death or degradation. We found instead a different kind of defeat. The defeat of our certainties, our hatreds, our simple stories. The enemy could be kind. Mercy could come from unexpected sources. The most dangerous weapon might be the one that challenges everything you believe. She closed the book, looked at her grandchildren. Remember this, the world is more complicated than any government tells you. People are more complicated. Even in war, humanity can persist. Even enemies can show mercy. That is the truth worth remembering. The grandchildren sat in silence, processing, trying to understand. Eventually they went home, back to their own lives, but they carried the story with them, as Keiko had carried it, as Hana and Tomoko and all the others had carried it. The story of 127 women who expected hell and found humanity instead, who learned that the most powerful force was not weapons or hatred, but the simple choice to see each other as people first, who survived not just the war, but the transformation it forced upon them. Keiko died in 95, age 73, surrounded by family. At peace, in her will she left instructions. The diary was to be preserved. The story was to be told, not because it made war seem kinder than it was, but because it revealed that even in war, people could choose mercy over vengeance, dignity over degradation, life over death. These choices mattered. They mattered to those who experienced them. They should matter to those who remember them. The final image in that old photograph, faded now, colors bleeding into sepia tones, but still clear enough to see. 127 Japanese women, American guards, Dr. Benjamin Hayes standing slightly apart, one hand in his pocket, where an origami crane rested over his heart. All of them looking at the camera, all of them human, all of them proof that the impossible was not only possible but necessary. That truth was more complicated than propaganda. That mercy could survive even the worst that humanity had to offer. The war had lasted 6 years. The transformation it forced lasted a lifetime. And in the end, the truth won. Not the truth of who was right or wrong, not the truth of victor and vanquished, but the deeper truth, the one that mattered most, that we are all human, that mercy is a choice, that even in darkness, light can break through, that the most powerful weapon is the one that transforms hearts instead of destroying them. That is the truth worth fighting for, worth remembering, worth passing down through generations. So that perhaps, just perhaps, the next time we face darkness, we will remember to choose light, to choose mercy, to choose to see the person instead of the enemy. That was Dr. Hayes' gift, not just to 127 women in a California camp, but to everyone who hears their story, the gift of possibility, of hope, of the knowledge that we can choose to be better than our worst impulses, better than our propaganda, better than our fear. We can choose humanity, even when it is hard, especially when it is hard. That is what they taught us. That is what we must remember. That is the truth that sets us free.